Awesome. All right, hello everybody. Hello everybody. I'm Will Horvath, and I'm a programming director with the Federalist Society, and I'm very excited to introduce our two guests today for what should be a really interesting discussion on AI. We're co-sponsoring this event with the Law and Technology Society, and they have a quick announcement before we get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Karan. I'm the president of the Law and Tech Society. If this conversation gets you interested in AI, we're having a lunch talk next Friday about AI and the practice of law, discussing how AI and those technologies are actually affecting what law firms are doing, how they're operating, and how they're advising their clients. So please, if you're interested, come check us out next Friday.
Only thing I'd add is when this conversation gets you interested.
Yes, right.
But, all right, so our guest today is Jamil Jaffer. Jamil is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, where he's also an assistant professor of law. Jamil is also a venture partner at Paladin Capital Group and serves on the boards or advisory boards of several companies. Jamil's previous experiences include serving as associate counsel to President George W. Bush, working in several roles at the Justice Department, and serving as chief counsel and senior advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Jamil holds his BA cum laude from UCLA and his JD with honors right here from the University of Chicago Law School. While he was here at the law school, Jamil was a member of the University of Chicago Law Review and a managing editor at the Chicago Journal of International Law. Jamil holds an MA with distinction from the United States Naval War College. After law school, Jamil has clerked for Justice Neil Gorsuch on the U.S. Supreme Court, and then Judge Gorsuch on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, as well as for Judge Edith Jones on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 5th Circuit. And joining Jamil today in this fireside chat is Professor Anup Malani, who is the Lee and Brenna Freeman Professor of Law here at the law school, and as well as professor at the Pritzker School of Medicine. Professor Malani's research interests include law and economics, health economics, and development economics. Professor Malani's recent research in law and economics includes analyzing judicial decision-making and analyzing the legal implications of blockchain. Professor Malani has also conducted extensive research on the control of infectious diseases. Professor Malani was the founding faculty director at of the Tata Center for Development at the University of Chicago. He is also a co-founder and faculty director of the International Innovation Corps. Professor Malani holds his PhD and JD with high honors from the University of Chicago as well. And after graduation, Professor Malani clerked for Judge Stephen Williams on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor on the U.S. Supreme Court. So with that, please join me in welcoming our two guests.
So thank you to the Federal Society and the Law and Technology Society for hosting this event, and thank you, Jamil, for joining us. So I want to get us started. This is, obviously AI is at the forefront of many of our minds, and there's both excitement and fear around this new technology, especially with the recent announcements by OpenAI and release of their products. And the government has followed very quickly with at least an executive order. So the Biden administration released a 111-page order recently, within the last 2 weeks. What do you think of that executive order, and where are you on the spectrum between excitement on the one hand and fear on the other?
So I'm definitely in the excitement camp. We've heard a lot of this talk about the potential for generative AI to eventually become general AI, and this capability that these computers have to think like a human and reason beyond the bounds of the system that's created them. But we're nowhere near that. we're not near general AI, and the question whether we'll ever get there is a hotly debated one. There are some who say we'll be there in 3, 4, 5 years, a decade. We've been talking about quantum computing. It's always 10 years away. So we'll see if we ever get to general AI. But at this point, I see a lot of opportunity. I see a real unique opportunity for AI to raise all boats, as a rising tide would. To really up-level people who have a particular skill set, allow them to focus on that skill set and take a lot of the easy stuff off their plates, right? And take a lot of the labor part of the work, or in terms of intellectual capital, and allow you to deploy yourself doing higher level reasoning. And so, in my view, it's going to be a game-changing technology going forward, and we do ourselves a disservice by worrying about these edge cases, right? I think that it's important to know about the edge cases. It's important to understand where the potential national security challenges might be, potential cybersecurity challenges. But these unhelpful statements put out by people, by the way, who are leading on generative AI, saying that we should treat it like nuclear weapons, right, or a biological weapon, is just unhelpful. These one-line statements that claim make hugely concerning claims, and it's interesting that you see being put out by the people who've led on this front. Makes you wonder why they're saying that, right? You have OpenAI, Sam Altman calling for regulation of AI, much the same way Mark Zuckerberg has called for regulation of social media, and you wonder, well, why are the leading players in this domain calling for regulation, right? You'd think they wouldn't want regulation; they want to expand their business, but of course they have the advantage now. Right? So regulation actually helps them lock in that advantage. They can afford to comply with regulations at a time when up-and-coming new starters, new players, are going to have more of a challenge. So I think there's a real possibility that you hamper innovation. On the EO, I'll say this, I think it's really important that we do talk about trust, safety, and security in AI. I think that's a critical piece of the conversation. The EO, by and large, even though it's 111 pages of crazy government stuff, it's by and large, it's not that bad. It directs the government how to use it, how to think about it. It leans forward in a lot of areas in government use. Where I think the EO potentially goes wrong and goes a lot further than anybody expected it would until the day it came out, is this use of the Defense Production Act to impose reporting requirements on companies that create large language models that potentially have the ability to be used for problematic purposes. It's only a reporting requirement, right? So it's not directly regulatory, but the way in which it's framed, the requirements it requires to report on, and the like, could very well have the possibility of causing companies to spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time, spend a lot of effort. There may be benefits in trust, safety, and security from that, but there's also the possibility that it hampers innovation. So I worry about that. It also makes clear that even though they want Congress, they call on Congress to move. It's clear that Congress is going to take its time in figuring this out, probably the right answer. But that's not fast enough. It's the administration is taking efforts to move more quickly. They're also using the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to impose reporting requirements on cloud providers. And so that's another piece of this as well.
Okay, let's go back to you jumped right in, so I love this. Let's talk about industry capture.
Yeah.
Right, that was your fear. So, I feel compelled to argue the other side.
All right, great.
So let's try with two arguments. So one argument is, look, people have these concerns about privacy, about whether or not it's going to be malevolent or used for bad purposes. And so one argument in favor of early regulation, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, but early regulation is it builds consumer trust. It actually grows the market if you're worried about it. Okay. A second one is a little bit more complicated, which is a lot of companies, a lot of countries are going to be racing, and we're going to eventually talk about national. A lot of countries are racing both to have an economic and national security lead in AI. And one of the challenges is regulating that. And that's true whether you're talking about inside the United States or outside the United States. So maybe what's really going on is both industry and the US government would prefer to have a small number of players actually be far out in the lead, posing the real risks, and then being able to regulate a small number of parties is easier than regulating a large number of parties. So what we want is we want a small number of participants, and we can monitor them carefully and have access at the highest levels. That's much easier than tons of startups and open source and free-for-all.
So I don't doubt that it may be easier to regulate with a small number of players, but that is not what has driven the vast majority of our success in our innovative economy and our capability to expand and rapidly innovate in this country on technology issues, right? We've actually benefited from a huge base of small players coming up, running rapidly, fighting hard, fighting for the edge. And by the way, it does turn out that sometimes when it's all said and done, you end up having 2 or 3 large players that dominate. You look at today, the social media space, you look at search, you look at a lot of the internet technologies. It began with a wide open field, it's narrowed, but it hasn't narrowed in large part due to monopolistic behavior. It's happened, I think, in large part because they've been successful and they have products people want. Now, whether you think people are right to want those products or people are giving up too much privacy to get Google search or Google or Gmail or whatever it is, that may be true, but those are consumer choices, right? It's not like you don't know that Google is reading your emails when it sends you ads about stuff you just wrote an email about, right? You know this. You're choosing to be the product, right? That's a consumer choice, right? You want this free email service. Even though, by the way, even a search company, their search on email is terrible. I don't understand how it's possible. But look, so I think there's a real mistake we might make by saying, look, if the answer is we only want a small handful of companies, the way to get there is to regulate them into being a handful of large players. And by the way, there are other countries that have tried this, right? Europe does this all the time, right? They manipulate the market, get a handful of small players, and then try to regulate them. Let's just talk about Europe's innovation, right? There's not a single major cyber company that's been successful come out of Europe. We have dozens in the US. Why? They have a massive regulatory and tax footprint. We don't. So if we want to adopt, there's this whole theory right now, by the way, that we're behind Europe because we don't have a GDPR, whatever privacy law. We're behind Europe because we've allowed these big tech companies to grow and scale. We're behind Europe because we're not going to regulate AI quickly, although now we are, right? We don't want to be behind Europe. I actually think a lot of the reason the Biden administration moved so quickly is they didn't want to get behind Europe. But then you say to yourself, isn't being behind Europe exactly the place we ought to be, given how successful our economy has been and how miserably unsuccessful their economy has been?
So one question might be why we're in such a rush. And I think your last answer teased this up. When we think about other technologies, it could be the internet, it could be social media, it could be CRISPR, it could be blockchain. We are regulating, but it took us a long time to actually regulate. This is one of those technologies that we're regulating within the first year of a major product announcement. Now, you could argue that we've been doing this for many decades, but that's true about almost all technologies. They build on the shoulders of giants, but by the time they become marketable, we still wait a long time.
Right.
Why are we in such a rush? What's the political economy here?
I'm not sure. I think part of it is, I think there's a few things going on. One, I think there is a lot of fear. There's been a lot of fear stoked by a range of folks. And I think different people have different motivations why they're stoking that fear. But there has been this fear that AI is going to destroy the American workforce, right? The American laborer, nobody will ever work again, right? By the way, that was the claim made about the internet itself, right? It's going to destroy the American workforce. It has not. It's changed the American workforce, to be sure, right? And AI will almost certainly change the American workforce, but in my view, for the better. Right? I think there are massive opportunities that it will offer rather than massive downsides. Another reason is I think the U.S. government is chastened by the fact that Europe has led on regulation for the better part of a decade now in the internet domain. They have really taken over the privacy space by imposing GDPR across the globe and on American companies. You'll notice, by the way, GDPR is only enforced against American companies. Right? If you look at all the enforcement actions under the European General Data Protection Regulations, 95% are enforced against American companies, 5% against European companies. So GDPR is not about privacy. It's about suppressing U.S. competition in Europe. And so, at least the way it's carried out, right? Whatever it says on its face. And so I think there was some fear that the Europeans will get ahead, and there's a desire to move forward. And then you have just inherent sort of, within both parties today, I think there's increasingly a regulatory trend, right? The Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party of a decade ago or of 2 decades ago. It is a much more statist, populist party that is more likely to regulate, more likely to spend, more likely to tax. And the Democratic Party was always oriented that way, and so it's no surprise that you see a collaboration going on between both parties to regulate in this domain. And then finally, I think there are legitimate national security and security concerns, right? There's no doubt that generative AI, in its more effective use cases, can potentially create new biological compounds, can create new cyber malware and cyber capabilities, and could make it easier for non-state actors and state actors to get chemical, biological, and radiological capabilities, right? That being said, for all the bad things it can create, it also has the ability to create responses to malware, right? And evolve, the same way it can evolve these capabilities, it can evolve the defenses. So it's not clear to me that it's a clear negative net.
Okay, so I'm taking away from that there's a ready audience for this because people can visualize the downside,
Yeah.
which might not have been the case with the internet or CRISPR.
Yeah.
CRISPR's close. Importantly, we just kind of in a political moment where both parties, their current orientation is pro-statism or pro-regulation.
Yeah. And the country feels that way too, right? There's a lot of concern amongst sort of the American people about their economic situation, how they feel about their own success, their own capabilities. We as a nation in the globe are feeling like we're no longer the leading nation, right? We might be falling behind other nations, including China. And so Americans are looking to their government to do more, probably at a time when you'd actually want your government to do less.
So let's think about that international stage, and then we're going to turn to national security.
Yeah.
So if the U.S. does decide to, and the EO doesn't clearly do this, although it does a lot of things, so it's unclear what exactly is going to come out of it, perhaps. But if the U.S. decides to follow Europe's lead, and we already know China is in a very closed system with a high amount of regulation, although not obviously disarming on AI,
Right.
Orienting it towards maybe national security or state purposes, that leaves up very few countries that could potentially take the opposite strategy, which is let's not regulate, let's see what happens. Two candidates come to mind. One is India, another one's Israel.
Yeah.
Where do those competitors rank in your hierarchy of economic competitors to the U.S.?
Well, look, I mean, Israel obviously has really taken the cybersecurity market by storm. Their capabilities come out of their version of the NSA Unit A200 are leading the front on cybersecurity in a lot of ways. There are leading American companies, but you look at Microsoft and all of its purchases of cybersecurity companies in the last decade, every single one has been an Israeli company. Not one American company, all Israeli companies. And whether Microsoft's getting it right or wrong, right, it demonstrates a capability. Israel, of course, is busy right now. Their focus is not innovating. Their focus is maintaining their survival and responding to a major terrorist threat at a time when support for Israel and its fight against Hamas is decaying in the West. We see it on college campuses across the country. We see it in these protests happening in various cities. And so that's going to be a challenge going forward. India, on the other hand, is a really interesting case, right? India has the talent pool. It has the need for AI, right? As a population that needs it, can leverage it and benefit from it, and has the ability to build on it. Indian government, on the other hand, doesn't seem, even though it's a business-oriented, right? The Modi government's, sort of been touted for its business-friendly nature. But then you look at the way they've handled their social security system and their digitization of that, and it's been a cluster. And so, whether India can pull it off is a different question, right? Certainly, there's the opportunity. Will they be able to or not is a different question. I do worry that if we sort of adopt the regulatory approach, that we'll just see innovation generally wither around the globe, right? And that we'll just be a lot slower to benefit from the huge opportunities that we've seen reveal themselves just in the last year that we've been seeing generative AI make its splash publicly. I don't know about you guys, but I literally use GPT-4 every day. Not always for some big highfalutin thing, right? I have to use it to it's my primary form of Googling. I don't Google anymore. I ask ChatGPT because I get better, more effective answers. Sometimes the answers are wrong. Sometimes they're hallucinations, right? But I ask for citations and I ask for links and it gives them to me. And it's a very, it's you can now talk to it. It's crazy, right? And it's a very interesting. If you haven't tried it, right, you've got to go do it ASAP because it is.
Is there anybody that hasn't tried it yet? Raise your hand.
It's okay if you haven't, right? But it will, you should right now go download it. Go download the app on your iPhone or your Android phone. It will change your life. It is mind-blowing.
So, if we think that the Indian government, as opposed to Bangalore, can't manage that industry, and we think that Israel's distracted, it could be that the cost of regulation in the United States, or experimenting with regulation in the United States, is less.
Yeah. I've heard you going to say that.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think I'm probably where you are in terms of being bullish on AI, but we have to kind of think about where this EO puts us.
Yeah.
Can we afford to stumble? Because it's not that big a deal. We have some of the biggest companies that are doing it.
Yeah.
This is a unique technology that has, there's certain assets you have to do it well. You need to have
Yeah.
very large data sets,
Yeah.
and you need to have very large compute.
Yep.
And those with one exception. Those generally are in the United States, right? We'll get to that exception with compute in a second. So it's, we don't have that much risk.
Yeah.
Because we have the resource, we have the oil to produce this technology.
Until TSMC goes down.
Okay,
Right.
so we'll get
We
to
have the
that.
intellectual property.
We have
Yeah.
So we'll get to that in a second, because I think that is an important component of this, which is the chips. But I want to just ask,
Yeah.
it seems to me that you're describing a situation
Yeah.
where
We have the whip hand.
we're going very fast.
Yeah.
We can stumble. We can still recover.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that that's right. And actually, I think there is some value in some amount of government action here. I do think there are very real national security concerns at the edge cases. I do think that that in order to expand the base of people that are going to use it and want to use it and trust it, you've got to establish some level of trust, safety, and security around AI. So I do think government action is helpful here. It's not a net, I normally find myself in a position talking about government action as a net negative across the board, right? That's my normal orientation. I actually think government action in this space is actually helpful. I just think the footprint the government laid down in this executive order probably steps a little bit too far, right? When about a week before the EO came out, there was talk about what the administration was going to do is they were going to use the federal government's buying power. They're going to say, look, if you want to sell to the government, you got to do these 8 things. I love that kind of regulation, right? That's great. You want to spend your money, right? Put your money where your mouth is and spend it that way. And if you can move industry in that direction, hallelujah. Instead, they come in, they've got some of that, right? But they come with this additional thing of it's a very cleverly, don't get me wrong, it's a very cleverly written EL, right? That looks like touch on regulation because it's just reporting requirements. All we're asking you is tell us, how much compute you have. Just tell us whether you're working on AI models. Oh, by the way, tell us how you're securing those models. Tell us what the cybersecurity of those models is. Tell us about how you're securing the model weights. Tell us if you've done any red teaming. If you haven't done any red teaming, okay, well tell us why you haven't. If you are doing red teaming, tell us what the results of that red teaming. Once you have those kind of reporting requirements, right? You either know what's going to happen is one, they're just going to have to start doing stuff to appear to be doing stuff, right? And spending money and time and effort. And second, if they don't, it's just a basis to go to Congress and say, look at these horrible look at those horrible capabilities. Have you thought about whether it might be used to make a bioweapon? If you have, what did you do about it? These are all reporting requirements, right? Okay, well, look at what they told us. Look at what they did. We now need authority to control them because they're running wild.
Okay, there are a lot of directions we could take this, but let's go back to the semiconductor issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we think that compute is critical, we're great at design. We're not great at manufacture.
Yeah. We used to be.
We used to be. TSMC is great.
Yeah.
It's at the center of a geopolitical conflict. I can imagine 2 ways that this goes, and then maybe there's an alternative that I'm not thinking about.
Yeah.
I want to see which one you think is most likely. One is it makes Taiwan critical, and the conflict, potentially coming conflict with China, either hot or cold war, very, very important. Alternatively, what it means is that we really have to be more efficient than we already have been, because it hasn't been the most efficient effort to bring semiconductor manufacturing back home. We have to do that efficiently if we really think AI is a strategic technology that we need to keep control over, or at least have in the United States.
Yeah. I think in the short run, it makes TSMC in Taiwan dramatically more critical. I think the Chinese know that. I think they'll exploit it. I think they are not going after Taiwan because they're afraid we will get involved. I think they know we won't get involved. And I think the reason they know we won't get involved is because we can't. If the Chinese were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, we don't have the forces in the region to respond in any effective manner. It would take us months to get there. By that time, the game will be over.
And isn't it kind of like if the worry is that Taiwan has a manufacturing capacity that would be used to our detriment, there's a point in that war where we might say
We'll just take
we'd
that.
rather not have anybody have that.
Right, we'd rather just destroy TSMC, right? We'd rather
Yeah.
bomb those facilities. So that's a real problem, right? But on top of that, I think the Chinese are not, and I think even beyond that, if we had the forces in the region, it might change the game if we had the forces in the region, but the Chinese estimate right now, I think correctly, that neither this administration, nor the one before it, nor either administration that's likely to be coming in 2024, would fight a war with China, on any basis, no matter what they did. Because they don't believe that that any of the leading presidential candidates, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, have the wherewithal to fight a war. And the reason they don't think that is because they look around the globe and they look at the last 15 plus years of American foreign policy and they realize America has no stomach for a fight. We pulled out of Afghanistan embarrassingly, right? We pulled out of Iraq embarrassingly. We're fighting a proxy war in Syria to the extent we're fighting anything in Syria. We're allowing our troops to be killed on the battlefield in Iraq by Iranian proxies. We're allowing our troops to be killed in Syria today by Iranian proxies. We're not particularly in the fight in Ukraine. We're sending a lot of money and a lot of weapons, but we clearly don't want to go in, and we have no desire to go in. And then the idea that we're going to flow forces to Asia, fight a war against another nuclear power, yes, a much smaller nuclear power, over an island nation that's just off its coast, and bring all those naval assets in over 6 months, they don't think that's going to happen, and they're probably right.
Although it does point to a very rational point, and we'll get back to AI in just a second rather than a discussion about US-China. But the cost of bringing manufacturing to home quickly is tiny compared to that cost.
It's tiny, and
yet we don't.
Right, we're spending billions to bring it here over a decade, right? And we're bringing 4-nanometer technology, right? And with a lot
of regulations.
A lot of regulations. Oh yeah, I mean like water. I mean, it's the whole thing. It's our approach to this has been. Oh, by the way, who's building those factories? TSMC, right? So I mean, I guess it was an Intel factory, but like it's crazy, right? This is not manufacturing at home. And by the way, it doesn't have to be in the U.S. It can be our allies as well, right? There are a lot of low-cost places you can manufacture stuff. It doesn't have to be Arizona. I get why we might put it in Arizona, but it doesn't have to be. But do we really think this has been the solution? I don't think this is the solution. It's a temporary measure, but it's not even going to get there in time, right? And so, in the short run, there aren't other options other than TSMC, and China knows that.
Okay. So I want to switch back to AI for a second.
Yeah.
Go to those edge cases that you said.
Yeah.
They're edge cases, and we shouldn't be driven by them. But let's talk about them for a little bit.
Because they are real. They are real.
Yeah, they're real. And people are concerned about that,
Yeah.
perhaps more importantly. So there are, a few we can imagine, AI-guided explosive technologies such as nuclear or chemical. You can also imagine AI-driven efforts at developing new viruses or infections. So bioterrorism is potentially a risk. Now, is that a science fiction risk or is that a real risk?
I mean, you're better positioned to answer that, right? I mean, you've forgotten more about biotechnology than I ever learned, so it's hard for me to really answer that effectively with you here. I mean, I think based on what I've seen, it does appear that generative AI is creating opportunities to create novel compounds. That suggests that in the perhaps not so distant future, it might have that capability to build compounds that can be used for problematic purposes. I don't know how hard that is, right? I don't know how effective what people are using it for today is, but based on what I've read, it does seem like it's a non-trivial possibility.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of discussion about decentralized access to biological kits, to technology, to genetic technology to be able to create new viruses and entities. The real challenge is, trying to identify when there's something that is a threat. Like, so
how do you know the difference?
Well, not only how do you know the difference, but there's the first issue is how big is that pool of people that actually want to create this that would infect themselves first, right? Because there's a big risk with these viruses. You create them, they infect the people that create them unless you have a good. We're just talking about Wuhan potentially all over again. And the question is, does it spread beyond that? But the second thing that people are talking about is, how do we actually track these technologies to see where these issues arise? If we bring AI into the mix, presumably it's just speeding it up. Right? You can search for a deadly compound more quickly than rather than trial and error, something like that. But there's a flip side to that, which is AI can also help you develop defenses.
Right.
And one thing that I think may be under-theorized is the extent to which the defenses are enhanced by AI relative to the offenses. People are generally pessimistic.
Yeah.
They think offense benefits more than defense, but those are good open questions.
I agree, and by the way, we've had the same debate recently when it comes to quantum computing, right? Everyone's been talking about how quantum is going to destroy traditional encryption, and it's going to put us at sea, and as a result, you got to create these new quantum-proof capabilities as well. That's all true, but quantum also has the ability to potentially distribute one-time pads, right, unbreakable key ciphers at a distance, right? And so if you could actually effectively do that, again, hasn't been proven yet, right? But it's theoretically possible. You can imagine that the trade-off, because everyone's always talked about quantum being horrible for encryption, right? The trade-off could actually be nil. It could actually be a push. I think the same is true in cybersecurity when it comes to AI. The same could be true in biological compounds, right? The same could be true in CBRN. I just don't know enough. And by the way, you may be right. You may have a bunch of bad actors who try to use this capability, create it, and then kill themselves. And maybe we're better off net, right? Because they don't know how to manage it, and they're relying on AI to tell them about what to do. Although presumably they can tell them how to be secure as well. I don't know, but then you have to worry about, okay, so maybe they kill themselves off, but take a Wuhan scenario, it spreads, right? And then you're still at sea because even though they didn't intentionally release it, it's out in the population, potentially killing larger amounts.
Now, one thing that may be good about AI, again, I'm not a AI developer, or at least I'm not capable of evaluating the following claim, is the extent to which we can use. I
like how you caveat that you're not an AI developer. Are you playing with it at all?
Let's let's focus on.
That's a non-response.
The main thing is, could you actually track? So if you use GPT, every time you use GPT, unless you get a special license from OpenAI, they see what you're asking and how you respond to their responses. And that's potentially another, both a part of their overall training data set, but also they get to track. So the question is, what sort of AI is being used to develop these technologies? Can that be used as our mechanism for tracking? In this context,
a great surveillance state.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic for now. You can also see why, if that's the case, going back to our very first comment, our first discussion, it does make sense for the United States to want to have a few small companies that are generating these.
Yeah, like our telecoms. Yeah, easier access to the data and knowing what people are doing on it. Then you might imagine protections for Americans and the like we have in the foreign intelligence surveillance context. The problem, of course, is you don't know what you don't know. Right? And so going on this sort of roving search for who's using AI in bad ways and who's using it in good ways could create a lot of problems. And it could have a very detrimental impact on our sort of traditional view of searches and seizures, the First Amendment, and the like. That's a big concern as well. And so maybe the answer is, well, if you just don't let people do it at all, and the capabilities are isolated out of the program, they don't have to go looking for it, right? If you prevent AI from giving you these answers, they don't have to go looking for it, you don't need the surveillance state. But then how much innovation do you lose, right? How much innovation you take off the table? Then you say, well, we'll license biologists to do biological research, we'll license computer scientists to do this, and as if a government licensing scheme is going to solve this problem, right? It seems crazy to think that, the idea that the government can license its way into solving this problem, the capabilities are out there already. They're going to continue to grow. There are open source capabilities. The notion that the government's going to figure out a way to box this thing in, I think is a mistake. I think we're better off riding the wave of innovation, controlling for the edge cases to the extent we can, and actually taking the benefit while we can.
Yeah. So I think that we're at a good point where we might want to ask, see if anybody has questions.
I'm happy to follow people.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, awesome. Do we have any questions?
Thank you for this discussion. I find it very helpful. I was curious if you could elaborate a little on, I believe, if I understand correctly, your concerns about the EO demanding reporting requirements from these companies because of sort of resource allocation. Without that sort of requirement, how can we interrogate the veracity of these companies' claims? Starting with GPT-4, OpenAI is no longer opening that model to computer science researchers, to determine, like, are they publishing good data? Are there claims backing up? Or is this all sort of marketing trash, right?
Yeah.
Especially as these systems become mission critical for government, for national security, you want to know that they're making good products.
Yeah. So one, I don't have a problem with the government saying, if you want to sell to me, you have to disclose X, Y, and Z to me. They didn't choose to do that. They could have done that. They've done that in parts of it, right? That was what we thought the main muscle movement was going to be. And to me, that's the right kind of regulation, right? You want to sell to me? You got to tell me everything I need to know to make me comfortable buying it. The private actors, by the way, can do the same thing. Any company that wants to buy GPT-4 can say, I want to know X, Y, and Z. Doesn't mean they're going to get it, right? But they can demand that, right? And so there's market power opportunities, particularly for the government, which is a single buyer, or can play a single buyer on TV through an executive order, to leverage that buying power, that market power, to get access to information. That's number one. Number two, it's not clear to me you can't interrogate the capability of the system from the outside by assessing the responses you get from it. Right? It's not clear, why do you need to have Microsoft source code or Apple source code to know whether, in fact, it's a safe operating system or it works? Right? You don't. In fact, we don't get it today. We don't demand that Apple or Microsoft or IBM or whoever it is open their source code to the government. In this case, though, we're saying, no, you've got to open some level of your cybersecurity protections in your source code to the government in this case, right? At least if you meet certain computer requirements and certain model size requirements, right? And the real question is, this is, at the end of the day, the federal government, right? Do we really know enough about what to regulate and how to regulate? Do we even think the government can practically keep up with the rate of evolution and the pace of change? And if not, are we simply imposing regulations that'll be outdated by the second they're on the paper, right? And will ultimately just result in compliance costs with no real net benefit to security or society? That's a real threat, because the innovation's happening at light speed. The government does not move at light speed.
So obviously, cybersecurity breaches are a really big problem, and a lot of companies are handicapped in being able to respond to those cybersecurity attacks because of various laws regarding cybersecurity breaches. A few years ago, Congress was considering passing the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act, which would have essentially gave these companies letters of marque in order to participate in hackbacks. What are your thoughts on granting some of these companies some very limited immunity to properly protect themselves from cyber attacks?
Well, I think there's a difference between protecting yourself, defense, and deterring action, which is sort of offense, right? You got to demonstrate you have a capability, you can push back against it, and then deter the actor from coming after you again, right? I think what you're describing, the kind of active cyber defense you're talking about, hackback and the like, it's one thing to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go find my stuff that was stolen and follow it back to the attacker's computer, and maybe even try and take it back, right? Or take it back while it's in transit. That's one level of things. It's another thing to say, I can go into somebody's computer system, not only take my stuff back, but blow up their computer system so they can't do it to me again, right? To me, that strikes me as very problematic, right? Because for all the reasons we don't allow, look, if you're walking down the street and a mugger grabs your wallet out of your pocket or grabs your purse and takes off running, you can run after them, tackle them, and take it back. But they go into a house, you can't go in the house and go after them, right? You got to call the cops. The cops will come and deal with it, right? The same is true in cyber domain, right? The reason we think there are these lines, these boundaries, is because we recognize there are likely to be deleterious effects of that action if you go further, right? And the same is true in the cyber domain, right? If we authorize private sector companies to go running roughshod and going after the Chinese government or going after this, this proxy actor that might be acting on behalf of the Russians or not, right? Do we think the likelihood of a state-to-state conflict or a non-state actor in a state conflict might grow? And the answer is absolutely yes. The reality is the U.S. government has the capability and potentially the knowledge to go after these actors. We're just choosing not to. We've been taking on the chin in the cyber domain for the better part of 2 decades. China's extracted billions of dollars a year, over $1 trillion in total out of the U.S. economy, stealing American company intellectual property and repurposing it for economic purposes in China, right? What have we done on that front? Hardly anything, right? And that's a real problem, right? And so if you don't deter the adversary, they're going to continue to do it. And it's not like the Russians aren't doing it either. The Russians do it through proxies, right? You see all these ransomware gangs. There's a reason why they're all operating out of Eastern Europe and Russia. It's because they're doing it with the tacit consent of their governments and the Russian government, right? Because they're on the take too, right? And so this idea somehow that this isn't in part nation state behavior, and it's not something that can be deterred. It can. We just choose as a nation not to practice classic deterrence in the cyber domain for a variety of reasons. All of them probably stupid.
Could I ask you a quick follow-up to that? So do you think government is really the best job for deterring that? Like you talked about some limited form of self-defense. You know, when you start getting, you know, government bureaucracy involved in trying to counteract, you know, some teenager on a laptop who's, you know, hacking into some server, wouldn't it be more appropriate in that instance to just grant that company the ability to, you know, quickly neutralize that threat versus, you know, kind of going through like this long, arduous process?
Well, so two things. One, I'm not really worried about the teen in a basement, right? I'm worried about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea hacking at scale, right? That teen in the basement is not stealing billions and trillions of dollars of intellectual property. They're not conducting ransomware attacks against Colonial Pipeline and taking down the largest pipeline on the East Coast, right? That's not some kid, right? This is not, you know, this is not war games, right? We're not some like, you know, Matthew Broderick hacker. Those of you guys, none of you are old enough to remember war games, but if you've seen that 1980s movie, right? But this is not the scenario we're worried about, right? The real scenario is nation-state actors, and that is the appropriate role for the government to go after those and to combat those things. By the way, the things that look like hacking gangs for money, the ransomware gangs that are doing all this destruction across the U.S. economy, those are primarily Russian and Chinese-backed nation-state actors, proxies. There are people who hack in the daytime for the government and at nighttime hack for their own account and for the account of their bosses, all with their approval of their overall command structure. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I was surprised on how quickly you waved away that the U.S. would defend Taiwan if China were to invade it.
Oh, I think we should, don't get me wrong. I just think we won't.
If that's the case, then why wouldn't China act now, given, you know, you mentioned TSMC,
Yeah.
They're developing in Germany and
Yeah.
Arizona and elsewhere. Don't you think if that were really the case, China would know and say, well, I guess
Yeah.
we have to move now, given, you know, the semiconductor
Yeah.
infrastructure being built up in other countries?
Three reasons, I think, why they're not going now. One, there might be a little bit unsure about whether we will or we won't, right? There's been some ambiguity, right? Jake Sullivan is always saying we're not going to do it, we'll send weapons. Joe Biden, he's going on TV and saying, we will be there with the military, right? And so I think this is, by the way, I think this is not Joe Biden being old and slow. This is actually intentional, right? It's an intentional ambiguity. But the problem with intentional ambiguity is all that does is create an incentive for people to test our boundaries. It doesn't do the thing they're hoping it's going to do, which is stall the action. It might stall the action temporarily, but in the long run, it's the same problem in the cyber domain. We don't respond. It gets people to test our boundaries and go further and further and further and see how far they can push us before we punch back, right? And so that's I think one. There's still a little bit of ambiguity. Number two, they're not ready. That's the biggest reason, right? I think they have taken a lesson away from Ukraine. One lesson to take away from Ukraine is the U.S. doesn't have the stomach for the fight when it comes to militarily. But they do recognize the U.S. will pour in money and weaponry, and so they want to be able to go in and not make the mistakes the Russians did. They want to know they have the force capacity and the military capacity to do it, and they can neutralize all opposition rapidly. They will not succeed in Taiwan. They know they're going to have to fight a guerrilla war. There are people in Taiwan who will retreat to the mountains and fight back from the mountains. But if they can neutralize the bulk of and sort of end the war rapidly, you know, at least publicly, it makes it a lot less likely for the U.S. to go and get there, right? If we're 6 months away from having forces there and they end it in 2 weeks, will there be any appetite for the U.S. to go back and retake the island? No, right? And so they're waiting to build up their forces and their capacity and to be confident, unlike the Russians had false confidence, that they can do it and do it effectively. I think that's the largest play. And then the last piece of it is, there was a third piece, and I can't remember what it was.
What if you lose the factory? What if you lose manufacturing capacity?
If they lose it, yeah.
If
Or
we're
we
going to
take
lose
it.
the island,
Yeah.
well, even if we don't take the island, if we destroy the manufacturing capacity, there's a choice we'll face, like how much do we lose versus they lose.
Yeah.
How does that calculus play out?
Yeah.
Are they going to lose more? How is their chip capacity coming relative to ours?
I mean, they have by far more chip production capacity today than we do, right? Actual the ability to make chips. Can they pivot it to the more advanced chips? They mostly are able to make today commodity, what you call commodity chips.
Yeah.
By the way, those commodity chips run everything, right? Yes, they're not the ones in the latest, you know, M3 Max or the latest iPhone, but they run everything else. And so the idea that we can do without commodity chips also false, right? But if the Chinese, if TSMC is gone, they still have a manufacturing capacity that we just don't have at all.
So
right?
how do they stand
We're
on
very
cutting
limited.
edge chips, which are going to be potentially more important for AI
Yeah.
and for...
Yeah, I mean, they're working on it, right? I mean, they may not have, I don't think today, or even probably in the immediate future, that they could build NVIDIA GPUs, right? They don't have the know-how yet. How far they are away from it, I don't know, right? But they don't have, one, it's not clear they can get to the right chip size, but also there's transport on the chips, right? And so the transport is one of the hardest parts, and that they're not there yet. And so I think they've got some time. Then they've got to build that manufacturing capacity. We have starved them of equipment to make that capability, right? Because we're preventing them from getting ASML capability, we're preventing them from getting Lam research capability and the like. And so we're making efforts to prevent that from happening. You know, in the long run they get it, right? In the short run, maybe they're just as damaged as we are, right? But then they starve us with commodity chips, and then it makes our delays in getting cars, a minor thing compared to it's everything, right? It's the TVs, it's everything we use.
Yeah, Randy.
Thank you both for speaking. My question is, there have been many documented instances of these large language models not just being wrong, as you said, but of
making stuff up.
Well, not just making stuff up. That's, I think, a separate problem. But
okay.
Outputting answers that are geared towards directing people in specific outcomes. And
they have bias built in.
Yes, bias built in. And you say that you use it for more than Google to get information. And
yeah.
I wonder, as that becomes more common, more and more people use it, do you have concerns about allowing so much information to come from systems that are controlled by people and companies that have a history of trying to determine what information can be shown, and in some cases of collaborating with the government to show specific kinds of government-allowed information?
As opposed to Google, or any of the other, as opposed to any of the
not
other,
as opposed
but as opposed to any of the other platforms I might use to conduct my searches today, right? I mean, this idea somehow that any algorithm is not going to have some amount of the creator's built-in biases. I mean, you're putting model weights in place. By the way, and the way you're selecting those model weights, it's kind of really interesting, right? The level I will admit that I don't get deep on this, right? But a lot of it is trial and error. A lot of it is what model weights happen to work to get you as close to a human-like right answer as possible, and you're just sort of monkeying with things, right? This idea of temperature, right? Which is how far it deviates from a pure selection of the most likely next word, right? The reason we've settled on a temperature of 0.7 giving the most human-like responses is because that's what works. It's not because there's some science or math behind 0.7 being the right temperature, right? There's no theorized answer to why that's the case. It just happens to be trial and error that's worked. So one, I'm not sure it's you can manipulate it by the data you feed in, certainly, right? And you can tune it so it gives you the answers you want. But just for every ChatGPT that gives you if you're worried about liberal bias, right, that gives you the, oh no, don't invade Taiwan, or because by the way, we've tried this. We're going to actually running a war game at George Mason, running a Taiwan scenario, having a set of human competitors running the serving national security councils, and we're going to run against ChatGPT and maybe one other model to see what the responses are. And in trial runs, as we try this out, right, sometimes the answer is, well, you really shouldn't do that. It's a bad idea, right? You're likely to end up in war and this and that, right? If you press harder, and you're like, no, look, this is a hawkish president who wants to go toe-to-toe with China and really push back. If you push it around enough, it gives you better answers, right? And so you can manipulate the system as well, even though it may be trying to manipulate you at the outset. So do I worry about it? Sure. Do I worry that there won't be competitors that will respond? We live in a free market system, right? You want to go create a ChatGPT that has a conservative bias? Hallelujah, let's do it, right? But no, instead what people want to do is they want to be like, oh my God, I can't believe how biased Twitter is. By the way, conservatives who are so upset about Twitter being biased are complaining on Twitter. They're being suppressed on Twitter, but all of our complaints are on Twitter. WTF?
Yeah, Spencer.
I certainly agree with you about the serious risks that would happen if our enemies threat China invade Taiwan. If the risks are so high, why don't we just arm Taiwan with nuclear weapons to deter invasion to begin with?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny. The Taiwanese are not. They're not as forward-leaning as you'd expect, right? It's kind of shocking. And even when you're talking so there's two parties in Taiwan, right? The DPP, which is sort of the more American-oriented party today, and the KMT, which is the original Kuomintang, right? The original sort of Chinese independence party. They tend to be more pro-China right now. The DPP tends to be more pro-American, whatever. DPP is in power, but it looks like KMT might win the next election, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But when you even ask DPP about like, hey, like if the U.S. were, if the U.S. were to recognize you tomorrow, would you want that? And you don't get a clean, absolutely, yes, we want, there's talk about, the deeply held desires of the Taiwanese population, but they're worried about what happens on day next also. I think if we were to say, hey, we'll do the Russian play, we'll put nuclear armed missiles on Taiwan, I think they would be like, whoa, please do not send your nuclear weapons to us, right? I'm not positive about that, but I think that would be the instinct, right? You look at even what they buy today, they're not buying the stuff that actually would help them defend against China, right? They need land-based harpoon. Why are they not buying land-based harpoon? This is the thing you need. They're buying all sorts of other crazy stuff that they can't even use. They're not preparing their military in the way they need to. The current rotations, they've gotten better. The current rotations of the reservists, right? They have a tremendous number of people potentially under arms, but their reserve rotations aren't effective. Their battle readiness is not there. The Chinese know it. The Taiwanese know it. They're not doing a lot to get up to speed. And I can't tell whether it's because they expect that we'll be there or they know we won't, and therefore they're like, why does it matter? I can't tell which it is, right? But what it isn't is, oh yeah, we see a real threat. We're going to get really ready. And we see what happened, or we saw what happened in Ukraine. Let's get ready now. And
it's increasingly becoming that way because there's a generational divide in
Yeah.
sentiment, pro-U.S. sentiment.
Yeah.
And it's not the younger generation that's pro-U.S.
It's not going. That's going the wrong way.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to sort of revert back to Randy's question.
Yeah.
If you view GPT as tech infrastructure, something that can be used to solve problems much like pipelines, not energy infrastructure, then the government regulating for adequacy and resilience is not a new concept.
No,
right?
not at all.
And so I wanted to ask, isn't the regulatory apparatus the right level to look at if we know that everyday users are not going to be fact-checking what ChatGPT is telling them themselves? They're not going to be looking out for a lot of the indicators of misinformation or other issues that are propagated by generative AI that they're not if they're not being corrected by the platform.
So I think there's two things you said there that we should talk about, right? One is AI critical infrastructure, and if so, should it be regulated as such? And if so, what does that regulation look like, right? But then the problem you're talking about is not a critical infrastructure problem. It's not, if we don't do this, it'll go away. You're talking about, well, as applied, might people not use it effectively? Might they be might they be diluted, right? That's a different problem than it's critical infrastructure, and if we lose it, we're screwed. So we need to really defend it well, right? So on the critical infrastructure, we need to defend it well problem. I guess what I would say is a few things, right? One, there's little evidence that we're very good at defending critical infrastructure generally, because one of our critical infrastructure areas is IT and cybersecurity, and the government is not particularly good at that on its own, much less the idea that somehow government's going to be better than industry at a rapidly moving, rapidly evolving threat. We've been talking about government regulating the cyber domain for a decade. It hasn't been good at it. To the extent it's done it, it's been a fail, right? It's been a check-the-box compliance regime that actually probably puts you more behind cybersecurity than you need to be. So them doing it in AI, I think, is probably dramatically worse. It doesn't mean, again, we don't need guardrails, we don't need boundaries, we don't need frameworks, we don't need some things that create trust, safety, and security that will allow people to take it up more readily. But the government getting in on a heavy-handed, treat it like it's a federal highway, the federal highway system, right? Or pipelines. By the way, they're terrible regulated pipelines. Also, TSA has that responsibility. What a joke. I mean, come on. Can you imagine? Again, the head of CISA at DHS is a friend of mine, but you want DHS regulating AI? Holy crap! That's they can barely do their job as it is, right? Look at the border, right? If that's what they're bringing to AI, I don't want any of it, right? But then on the consumer use side, right? I'm not sure why it's obvious to assume that consumers won't fact check it, right? The consumers won't be concerned that it's giving the wrong answers. They won't be worried about bias. They won't push back. They won't ask for alternative capabilities, right? I'm not sure there's any, other than the Americans are dumb and we all read social media and we take all our news from TikTok, which unfortunately seems to be happening, right? Other than that evidence that's happening in the world around us, right? I'm not sure that there's any reason to believe that we wouldn't push back harder on something that's so core to understanding and dealing with the world.
mean, if I may push back on that.
Yeah,
like,
please.
There's literally a lawyer who used ChatGPT to submit a brief.
Yeah,
to
what happened? And what happened to him? And what happened to him? What happened to him?
Well, I mean,
What happened to him? What happened to him?
He got sanctioned, right?
He got sanctioned.
But,
And by the way, there are potential bar proceedings against him, right?
But
So
if
you
you
think
didn't-
how many of you guys use ChatGPT to do law work at your law firm? There's your answer.
I mean,
You didn't need the government. You didn't need the government. You didn't need the government to come in. You have a private regulatory body, right? The state bar run by a bunch of lawyers, right? Who are regulating themselves. It's working, right? Yes, you had the judge impose sanctions, right? That's because he filed a government proceeding, just like you probably sanctioned if you filed with a paper with the government, right? But let's talk about it in law school, right? What's the policy at the law school?
No use. But I mean, if a lawyer didn't bother checking, you think the average Joe who's asking for the neighborhood restaurant is going to bother checking anything? Where, you know, we're asking, you know, for ChatGPT for a rundown of the Israel-Palestine conflict, for example. Like if a lawyer who had the threat of sanctions on his head didn't bother doing the due diligence reading it or fact checking it, the average consumer in an average use case might not have that.
It's not going to be the case that there isn't going to be some person that does something silly. That's always going to happen.
Right.
The question is that the modal person for a lawyer, modal situation for a lawyer, and I think that they're probably more conservative than that. They're really worried about that because there's a long run stream of profits they give up if they get disbarred. And in terms of a restaurant review, I agree for small things that's going to be the case. And maybe you think that sometimes for politics it's going to be the case as well. The question is, what incentive does the system have to actually go and manipulate these results? You know, even now, even if you thought that Twitter was biased, let's say, okay, there's pushback against that, right? And you do see changes, and so we shouldn't think of ourselves as necessarily being rescued from bias before. You should think about as that's an equilibrium dynamic, that there's some
That's
pushback.
the market acting.
Yeah, something like that. Some sort of pushback, I think, is quite possible in that context.
We have time for one quick question.
Oh, I just wanted to push back on the pushback.
Oh boy.
This is Chicago. That's great.
I'm in complete agreement with the gentleman on the other side of the room there. Specifically, we saw in some of the evidence uncovered in the Google antitrust DOJ trial, whatever you feel about that, put it aside for the moment, they ruined their Google search results through semantic search matching to appease market interest of finding searches that will click more relevant ads. So what is the market incentive to make the GPT outputs worse? The incentive is more profit once they've run out of runway. How do you correct
But
that?
you have to tell a story for why, what sort of, so there's one question of whether there's going to be error. I agree that there could be error and it could be profit driven because okay, that I buy. But the gestalt of these questions is there's a political valence to that bias. And that's not obvious to me. Are you going to make more money by pushing in the left direction or the right direction? It could be true that there is some more money to be made, but it's not obvious yet. And it's still kind of relatively early days. Like, part of this, I think, comes down to, do you view what happened with Twitter as the system operating, or do you think we just got lucky and rescued from bias? And to me,
By what happened with Twitter, you mean by Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and changing it?
I mean, I think that's the sense I'm getting, that you know, Twitter's purchase is what allowed us to see the bias. If you're of that view, then you have to ask yourself, is that kind of the system operating as it should be, or is it we got lucky? I don't know the answer.
And by the way, the revelations about even the recent revelations about Google and Facebook and the like, you know, working with the government on what appear to be pure free speech and political. Again, I haven't gone deep enough to know if that's right, but it certainly appears that way. That is having an impact on their success in the marketplace, a non-trivial impact, right? That's the market working. You want the government coming in and solving that problem? It's not going to work for you.
Can I leave us with one more thing?
Please.
The alternative isn't, you know, without AI, we're in this, you know, beautiful land with no bias.
Right.
It's TikTok and pre-existing Google search and every other technology. So we need to look at those counterfactuals when we think about that.
Well, thank you so much to Jamil.